There is a common misconception that people go crazy overnight. Society imagines madness as a sudden break, a spontaneous explosion, a moment where someone simply snaps and loses control. But the truth is far more brutal, far more delicate, and far more tragic. Behind every person who spirals into psychological chaos, there is always a story. A past filled with invisible injuries, accumulating pressures, and long-ignored suffering. Madness is rarely born in the instant. It grows in the shadows. It is sculpted over years, one wound at a time, until something inside finally cracks. This is the anatomy of that past. A past that shapes a person long before they collapse. A past that explains the chaos others only notice at the end. The early fractures, when the world first goes wrong. A person's descent rarely begins with something big. It usually starts with small, quiet fractures, moments that seem insignificant to outsiders but carry a monumental weight. For many, the brutality begins in childhood, where emotional security is supposed to form. Perhaps they grew up in a home where love was conditional, where affection was earned only through perfection or obedience. Or perhaps they lived with unpredictable parents, one moment affectionate, the next moment explosive. The child learns early that safety is inconsistent. Love becomes unstable. Trust becomes risky. Even worse, some children grow up in environments where they are humiliated, dismissed, or ignored. Their feelings are mocked, their needs minimized. They learn to hide their tears, to silence their fears, to bottle their anger. This suppression becomes a reflex long before adulthood. Every harsh word, every unmet need, every dismissal becomes a layer. These layers become scars. These scars become patterns. This is where the first seeds of instability are sown. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly. And the world assumes the child is resilient simply because they are silent. The slow-built rage. When suppressed emotions grow teeth. As the person grows, the emotional suppression continues, but their inner world becomes more complex. What they swallowed as a child begins to ferment. Anger buried long ago does not disappear, it mutates. Sadness that was never expressed becomes emotional exhaustion. Fear that was ignored becomes hypervigilance. And the person adapts. They become the one who bottles everything. The one who handles it. The one who carries burdens without asking for help. The one who pretends to be fine even when they are breaking. Their durability becomes their curse. Because on the inside, tension grows. And people around them never notice. They only see the mask, the calmness, the strength. They assume nothing affects them, they assume they can take more. And so, society, family, and friends pile more pressure onto the one person who is already cracking inside. Years pass. The suppressed emotions grow sharper, heavier. The person becomes a container filled with storms, but the container is never allowed to leak. Until one day it can't hold anything anymore. Trauma that never healed. The echoes that return later. No one goes crazy without trauma somewhere in the story. The trauma may not be obvious. Many people don't recognize their own wounds until decades later. Some survive emotional neglect. Some endure abusive relationships. Some experience betrayal from people they trusted. Some are silenced so many times that their own voice becomes foreign to them. Trauma has a strange way of resurfacing. What the mind represses, the body remembers. And when stress increases later in life, these old wounds return, not as memories but as symptoms. Panic attacks, emotional outbursts, dissociation, irrational anger, anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, depression that has no explanation. This is not madness. This is memory trying to scream. The brutal past shows up in the present, demanding to be felt. And because the person has learned their whole life to endure silently, they often have no tools to cope with the flood. So the flood overwhelms them. The breaking point. When the mind cannot hold anymore. Every human being has a psychological limit, but society rarely acknowledges it. People expect others to keep functioning, keep producing, keep striving even while suffering. The person who eventually goes crazy often reaches a point where the pain becomes louder than their self-control. This breaking point could be triggered by anything. The loss of a job, the end of a relationship, betrayal, extreme stress, or simply one comment that hits the wrong nerve. It is never the final trigger alone. It is everything that came before it. It is years of holding on, years of pretending, years of burying emotions, years of carrying heavy things alone, years of feeling unseen and unheard. At the breaking point, the mind does not collapse without warning. It collapses because it has been holding the weight of a collapsing world for too long. Suddenly, they can't sleep. They can't focus. They lose patience easily. They cry unexpectedly. They become paranoid, overwhelmed, confused, frantic. People around them say, "What's wrong with you?" But the real question should be, what happened to you all these years that nobody noticed? The inner chaos, when thoughts become loud. After the breaking point, the person enters a state that may feel like madness. Thoughts begin to race or freeze. The mind becomes both enemy and prison. Emotions become unpredictable. They may feel fear without danger, guilt without reason, anger without cause, sadness without explanation. Inside their mind, everything is amplified. A small problem feels like a disaster. A minor disagreement feels like rejection. A negative memory feels like fresh trauma. A simple comment feels like an attack. This is the aftermath of emotional overload. People assume they are crazy because they explode, withdraw, or behave irrationally. But what looks irrational on the outside is often deeply rational when you understand their emotional history. The person is not insane. They are drowning. They are overwhelmed by wounds that were never allowed to heal. They are fighting storms alone. They are trying to survive a mind that is tired of being strong. The isolation. When no one understands. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of psychological collapse is isolation. The person often feels alone even when surrounded by people. They struggle to explain their pain because they do not want to be judged, misunderstood, or dismissed. So they retreat. They stop answering messages. They avoid conversations. They hide their emotional state. They push people away. Ironically, the more they collapse inward, the more others see them as distant, cold, or unstable. They are labeled too sensitive, dramatic, difficult, or problematic, when in reality they are simply scared. Scared of burdening others. Scared of being rejected. Scared of losing control in front of people. Scared that if they speak, their pain will be too big for anyone to handle. Isolation becomes both a defense mechanism and a wound, and the silence worsens the spiral, the transformation. When breaking becomes becoming, here is the part society overlooks. People do not break because they are weak. They break because they have been strong for too long. Madness, if we call it that, is not the end of a person. It is a signal, a plea, a turning point. Every collapse holds a hidden truth. Something inside desperately wants to change. Sometimes going crazy is the mind's way of rejecting a life filled with pain. Sometimes it is the soul's attempt to free itself from years of suppression. Sometimes it is the body's demand for healing. Sometimes it is the spirit's rebellion against trauma. The breakdown can become a breakthrough, but only if the person finds understanding, not judgment. Support, not dismissal. Compassion, not ridicule. Healing. When the past is finally confronted, healing begins the moment the person stops fighting the truth of their past. For years they survived by denying, burying, suppressing. But healing requires honesty. It requires sitting with the pain, acknowledging the trauma, understanding the patterns, relearning emotional expression, letting go of toxic connections, replacing self-blame with self-kindness. Most importantly, healing requires help, something extreme survivors rarely ask for. A therapist, trusted friend, partner, mentor, or community can make the difference between losing oneself and rebuilding oneself. Healing is not instant. Healing is not linear. Healing is not painless. But healing is possible. The person who once spiraled can rise again with clarity, strength, and emotional depth. In fact, those who survive deep psychological collapse often become some of the wisest, most empathetic people. Because they have seen the darkness, they have faced it, and they learn to build light inside themselves. The final truth: no one goes crazy without a story. Behind every outburst, every breakdown, every emotional collapse is a life that was never easy. The brutal past is not an excuse, it is an explanation. People do not lose themselves for no reason. They break because they were forced to carry pain too heavy for too long. They fall apart because they never had a safe place to fall. They spiral because no one noticed the early signs. They shut down because the world ignored their cries. Madness then is not chaos. It is history. It is trauma. It is survival. And it deserves compassion. Because when you truly understand the brutal past of a person who goes crazy, you no longer see madness. You see a human being who fought alone for too long. You see wounds that never healed. You see a heart that tried to survive in silence. You see a story that could have ended differently if someone had cared earlier. And most importantly, you see hope not for who they were, but for who they can still become.